Okay. All right. So I was going to say about sacrifices. While they may have originally be seen as food for the gods, I may have mentioned it in Babylonian mythology, there is a work called the Numa Elish, which has their version of the creation. It has a version of the story of a flood. And in that flood story, after the human being is saved, he makes a sacrifice for the gods, and the gods are pictured in words as hovering over the smoke and imbibing the smoke, hungrily eating it because they've been starving, because there have been many people to offer sacrifices to them. But certainly we see as it develops in Jewish tradition that God is incorporeal, needs no food. And so there are different ways of understanding what was going on. Maimonides famously said that really God did not want sacrifices. It was really kind of a recognition that human beings were not ready to take the step to move from sacrifices to worship of God through prayer. Actually, Maimonides thought was even superior to that was philosophical speculation, meditation. So in order to make sure that the Jewish people would be able to understand the concept of one God and not have to deal with other issues, God left the sacrificial system available for Israel to worship their God, so that they didn't say, what's this newfangled invention prayer all about, instead of sacrifices. And some, such as the Ramban, Nachmanides, Moshe ben Nachman, sees greater meaning in the sacrificial system. And so that's indeed how our ancestors worshiped God up till the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. And once the temple was gone, we obviously no longer offered sacrifices, prayers, but there was always this idea that someday in the future, the Beit HaMikdash would be rebuilt, the temple would be rebuilt, and the sacrificial system might be restored. There are various opinions on that. But certainly one way of viewing it is the way that some say that when we commit a sin, a trespass, our life should be forfeit. So instead of our life being forfeit, the life of an animal is forfeit. As making it a concrete understanding of it. But there are different sacrifices of different purposes. There were daily sacrifices that were part of the temple ritual. And they were done for the public as a group. There were sacrifices to celebrate the different holidays. Once again, this was all done for the community in the temple. There were sacrifices that people brought on their own behalf when celebrating a holiday. One of the important elements of one of those sacrifices, what we call the shlamim, is that people generally didn't eat a lot of meat. And by slaughtering an animal as a sacrifice to God, and also using the meat as a meal to celebrate the holiday, you should pardon the expression, you're killing two birds with one stone. Or in this case, it might be one cow. Actually, it's a male offering, usually very few female animal offerings. Okay. And that would be the only time they really ate meat to speak of. And so when you celebrate a holiday, the idea of having meat as part of the diet for that celebration was a very important element in the ancient world. There were sacrifices that were brought when you did something wrong. What's interesting to note is if you intentionally did something wrong, you did not bring a sacrifice. It was usually for inadvertent violations of the Torah. Indeed, in Masechet Shabbat, the tractate in the Talmud of Shabbat, where it talks about the various 39 categories of labor, when you're responsible for violating them, if you know it is Shabbat, And if you know that what you're about to do is a violation of one of the forbidden things on Shabbat, that's called intentional. And for an intentional sin, you don't bring a sacrifice. But if you forgot it was Shabbat and you did that, you lit a fire, or you knew it was Shabbat, but you didn't know that you're not allowed to plow on Shabbat, that's a case of forgetting, of not knowing. And only then would you bring a sacrifice to God to kind of restore the balance, to make things right. Okay? So that underlies the sacrificial system. I'm not going to go into much detail next few weeks, as most of going to be talking about that. So we will probably pay somewhat short shrift to some of that. Now, as we said, noted, next week is going to be Purim. That means this week in the synagogue, the Shabbat before Purim, there's a special Torah reading. It's called Parshat Zachor, the passage of remember. Zachor Amalek. Remember what Amalek did to you. We're told in the Torah that when Israel left out of Egypt, that Amalek, one of these tribes that were in that part of the world, attacked the stragglers of Israel, the defenseless, the weak, and there's supposed to be an eternal war between God and Amalek, and we're supposed to remember that. And every year before Purim, we are told to at least remember that war, as it were, against Amalek by reading a special Torah reading in the synagogue, a special maftir portion. We'll keep that in mind. Amalek, we'll come to that when we go over the Megillat Esther. But by the way, in theory, so nobody run off and nobody turn off the computer, and please listen up if you're listening to a recording. Theoretically, if a Jew comes across an Amalekite, we're supposed to kill them, which would cause lots of problems in the world. All right, it's a very difficult thing. However, the rabbis eliminated that by saying when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire came along and all the peoples were exiled from their lands and everybody's mixed up, there is no way of knowing who an Amalekite is today. So you can't call somebody an Amalekite and kill them. All right, so nobody go out and claim that your neighbor that you're having a dispute with is an Amalekite and you're following Jewish law by killing them. All right, it's not a good defense in court. But I will add, there's a tendency in Jewish traditional circles to kind of identify anybody who attacks Israel or Israelites or Jews as being Amalekites. And there's some willing to take it to a very extreme, Mushugana, crazy people, which we have our share amongst Jews too, who says that we're totally sane, who make that into kind of a permission to do horrible things. There is no permission. There is no longer such an operating mitzvah. And the question really not, we can say whether or not it really ever was truly a mitzvah, but we do find it in the Torah. We find it in the story of Israel, the early days, and King Saul and King David dealing with Amalekites. Right? But today there are no Amalekites. There may be spiritual Amalekites, but that's a horse of a different color. Okay. Now let's come to Purim. All right, so now we've taken care of Shabbat before Purim. Purim now, one of the interesting aspects of Purim is that there are two possible different days to observe Purim. Most places in the world, such as Toronto, or I forget where, Saskatchewan, wherever you may be, Hawaii, Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, if you're in Russia, or Siberia, wherever you may be. Almost all of these places celebrate Purim on the night of the 14th of this month of Adar. The night of the 14th, and then the next day of the 14th, all right? Now, because the story takes place in Shushan, and we're going to read Megillat Esther tonight, and we'll see that, there was an exception made for Shushan. And Shushan celebrated Purim not on the 14th, because they were still fighting with the enemies of Israel on the 14th, but instead they celebrated Purim on the 15th of Adar. And so the way it's described by the rabbis, any city that is a walled city or was a walled city dating back to the time of Joshua celebrates Purim on the 15th of Adar. So for example, in Israel, if you're in Tel Aviv, you're up and down the coastline of Israel, or in the middle of Israel in the Galilee, most of the Galilee, you observe Purim on the 14th of Adar. But if you live in Jerusalem or Tiberia, you celebrate Purim on the 15th of Adar. So that is an important thing to remember. And if you go to Israel and you want to have 2 days of lots of fun, go to Tel Aviv for the first day of Purim and then go to Jerusalem for the second day of Purim. And when we come to the drinking part of it, as we'll talk about a little bit, make sure you have a good driver who's going to drive back and forth from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, because Israel's got lots of terrible drivers to start with. The first time I drove in Israel, I always had to take aspirin after I finished driving the car. Of course, it was a little tiny thing. All right. So I have for you, I will send it out to you eventually, but let's see if I got it here. Purim and its mitzvot. Okay. I will supply this with you later on. It's not mine. I stole it from the OU site and just cut it a little bit shorter to give you a basic background on Purim. A lot of this is in the readings I gave you. Certainly it should be in the reading of that you have from Isaac Klein. All right. I don't know why that's there. Okay. All right. So when we talk about the holiday of Purim, first thing to remember, it's not a holiday in the Torah. It's a holiday that is found listed in the story of it in the book of Esther, Megillat Esther. It occurs somewhere after 586 BCE, probably towards the end of that century. Takes place in Persia. It celebrates a victory that the Jews had over their enemies. And so the Megillat Esther that gives us the information about how to observe it is understood by the rabbis to give us 4 basic mitzvot, 4 observances that we are to follow to properly celebrate the holiday of Purim. The first of those is Mikrat Megillah, reading Megillat Esther. The second is the Purim Seudah, or Seudat Purim, the festive Purim meal. Third, Mishloach Manot, sending gifts to friends. And finally, Matanot Levyonim, gifts to the poor. Okay? And there's some special prayers that may be added to the course of the daily service that takes place on Purim, including a special Torah reading. And it's a day of celebrating. So if a person is in mourning, they're not allowed to observe the mourning in public. Okay, but also observes it in private is on Shabbat. Okay. Now, the reading of Megillat Esther really takes place at 2 different points. We read it both in the evening and in the morning. The evening takes place, sometime during the evening after sunset until dawn. And generally speaking, we hope to do it together in large groups, the synagogues. And when we read the Megillat Esther, we'll see in a few minutes, there's certain things that take place. I don't know how many synagogues are going to be open for the Megillah reading this year. Those of you who want to go to it, or you can listen online, preferably go to the synagogue. All right. Now, amongst the things that take place is there are 4 points in the reading of Megillat Esther where the person who is reading it for the congregation pauses. And those are 4 verses of redemption. They're listed right here. And so these passages are read by the congregation first, and then by the reader from the Megillat scroll itself. Similarly, he says, when it says the night that the sleep of the king was disturbed is customarily read aloud. The names of the 10 sons of Haman are supposed to be all recited in one quick reading without taking a breath. There are other certain passages that have special trope that as a reminder of the destruction of the temple. Okay. Now, before the reading of the Megillah, there are 3 brachot, 3 blessings that are recited. The first one is the mitzvah of reading the Megillah. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu al mikra Megillah. Second, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, praise the Lord God, King of the universe. Sha'asa nisim lanu la'avoteinu bayamim hahem bazman hazeh. Made miracles for our ancestors in those days at this time. And the third blessing is the Shehecheyanu that we say in the first night of our holidays. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Shehecheyanu v'kimanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh. Praising God, kept us alive and sustained us, enabled us to reach this joyous occasion. You can, like I said, I'll send this out to you if you want to get more details on it, but that's the important things. Remember, then there's a bracha that follows after the recitation of Megillat Esther. Now, another anomaly about Purim is normally we have our festive meals twice on the holidays, twice on Shabbat, one in the evening and one in the afternoon or lunchtime. Purim is different and exceptional in that the Purim meal, the celebratory Purim meal, Seudat Purim, is supposed to take place the afternoon of Purim, late in the afternoon, close to sunset, but before sunset. And so it's supposed to be very celebratory. It's supposed to have a nice meal, a sumptuous meal, meat and wine, those who eat meat, or otherwise something special that you should have. And more joyous than normal. There's also a tradition of drinking on Purim. Now, we find a statement in the Talmud that you're supposed to drink on Purim to such an extent you cannot tell the difference between blessed be Mordechai and cursed be Haman. And a lot of people who don't observe many Jewish mitzvot very well are very careful to observe this mitzvah, although they often use, other than wine, they will use other hard intoxicants. And if you are on the police officer and you need to make your quota of drunk driving tickets, Purim night during some synagogues is probably a good night to stay around. But obviously, if you are going to drink, it should be not in excess, and it should not take place if you're going to drive. Indeed, over the centuries, there's been a lot of rabbinic unease with this idea of overindulging. There's even a very famous story in the Talmud. I don't know that I shared this with you. that two rabbis got together for their Purim Seudah, and they got joking and what have you. And one rabbi, they were talking about slaughtering of animals, and one rabbi demonstrated it on his friend and slit his throat, killing him. But this was a great rabbi, so he was able to bring the guy back to life. So the next year, he invited the rabbi to join him again for the Purim Seudah. And the rabbi refused, saying we can't rely on miracles. Okay? So, if you are, it's probably, there are a couple of things that's in here. One, drinking has an important element in the story of Esther. We'll see. A second thing is Purim comes in normally this time of year, late March, April. You come off the winter when things have been very dark and bleak, et cetera, and people want to release, have some kind of release. And so Purim serves that purpose. And similar to Mardi Gras that you find in Christian traditions. But really, originally, it was just for wine. If you want to, so a lot of rabbis today say, you drink a little more wine than you normally would drink, and then you go lie down and take a nap. When you're sleeping, you can't tell the difference between blessed be Mordechai and cursed be Haman. Okay, so you'll see what's going on. Now, so you have these festive aspects to it, the food and the drinking. All these things have a celebratory purpose, but there are also two others, and especially the one I'm going to talk about now is in many ways superior to at least the previous one. We said there's a Purim, there's read the Megillah, there's a Purim Seudah, and then there's, I'm sorry, the third one here, Mishloach Manot, that's not the one I want to emphasize. Mishloach Manot is sending gifts one person to another. Traditionally, men would send men and women would send women. Two portions, two kinds of foods that they could eat, different cookies, meat, fish, anything that is cooked and they can consume right away. If it's a bottle of wine, a bottle of grape juice, a bottle of Coke, a candy bar, whatever it may be. This is the way of celebrating Purim. And it says, Mishloach Manot, sending gifts. Ish l'rayehu, one person to another. So the rabbis understood that since there's Ish l'rayehu, one person to another, that means you have to send a gift to at least one person. And it says manot, portions, which is a plural, and the minimum of a plural is two. So the rabbis understood mishloach manot means you have to send at least two portions of food to one friend to fulfill the mitzvah of sending out the mishloach manot. In this article that I took this from, a little tongue-in-cheek, he says one of the most popular food items that's been used for this mitzvah is the hamantash. I don't know if you know what hamantashen are. It's it's a dough that's been pastry dough that's filled with different kinds of fillings, and it's done in a triangle shape. Now, you will hear in Hebrew school, when kids go to Hebrew school and they learn about this, they are told that the hamantashen are shaped in a triangle because Haman wore a triangle-shaped hat, which of course is ridiculous because that's a much later tradition of wearing hats of that shape. Another explanation you find in the Hebrew name of the pastry is Oznei Haman, Haman's ears. So at least kind of a triangle shape, kind of looks like a little bit like an ear. The truth of the matter is, and I always have to share this with people, there was a popular dish, popular pastry in Europe, especially in Germany, And it would be this pastry dough filled with poppy seed. Now, in German, poppy seed is Mun. Taschen means pockets. So Mun Taschen would be pockets of poppy seed. But Jews heard Mun Taschen, and it gets eventually corrupted to Hamantaschen, hence the popularity of Hamantaschen on Purim. But it really has nothing to do with Purim, and it doesn't matter how you make it or whatever. Okay. Now, what is important to point out that Mishloach Manot means sending food items. We're not sending money. We're not sending clothing. We're sending things that people can consume. And the mitzvah is to do it the day, usually after the Megillah is read in the morning. Now, the most important, though, as many authorities point out, is that there is also an obligation to give gifts to the poor. Matanot le'evyonim. And once again, matanot is a plural, so that's two somethings. Le'evyonim, poor people, that means two poor people. So we understood that you have to provide money to support at least two poor people as part of your celebration of Purim. And this is one of the most important things. Many of the rabbinic authorities say that if you have to scrimp and have a little less of a Purim Suda, in order to send out matanot levyonim, gifts to the poor, you should scrimp on your Purim Suda to make sure that you send out proper gifts to those who are in need. And this can be anything: money, clothing, food. Ideally, it's person to person. A lot of synagogues have funds that they today that they will gather them together in order to supply the needs of people on Purim and give you the opportunity to fulfill this mitzvah. Okay, I just realized I'm going to stop sharing this. And let me just see something here. Just close that.
Rabbi, can I ask a question about the meal?
Sure.
You said it takes place during the day. So this year that would be on March 17th. Like it would be the day of Purim, not the eve before.
Yeah, that afternoon. Purim night is Wednesday night. All right. If I got it straight in my mind. And the Purim Suda, I know it's the 14th. I'll take your words, the 17th. Okay, this is what I wanted to do. So anyway, yeah, in the afternoon, sometime before evening. All right, it's that afternoon, right? Okay, let me just take care of a couple of things here. Do I have anything else open? Okay. And how can I get this to do a full spring? Okay. So now we will. You can still hear me okay? All right. I forgot I can do this. All right, so you can see this is Megillat Esther. We're going to go through it. I always like this. Yeah, I know my. No. Now, when we read Megillat Esther, one thing that I didn't mention, it's not really found in the older traditions as being part of Purim, but the custom has developed to wear costumes on Purim. So that everybody people dress up. Some people dress up for the synagogue. They dress up for their meals, especially kids. And one of the ways of celebrating is to make, every time we hear the name of Haman, I keep doing the wrong thing here, we make noise because we're supposed to blot out the memory of Haman. And so how do we do that? We do that by making noise every time that his name is mentioned. All right. So if we didn't, so how do we blot out his memory? There we go. That's where I went. Okay. How do we blot out his memory? By saying his name every year and making noise to blot out his memory. Now, if we really wanted to blot out his memory, what would we do? We wouldn't mention him. And nobody would know who he is or was. So in a kind of a silly way, in some ways, you might look at it, we remember Haman every year, and every year we blot out his memory by making noise whenever his name is mentioned in the synagogue, in the Megillat Esther. Okay. All right. Can we see the screen? Okay. Can we see? You got this in front of you? All right. Okay. So the book of Esther is not very long. We're going to go through it relatively quickly. There's certain aspects that I want to point out as we go along. Still don't have that. All right. So it begins by telling us when this takes place. It happened in the days of Achashverosh, who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. The Persian Empire was very large. This is after the fall of the Babylonian Empire, the rise of the Persian Empire. And so we're told in those days when King Achashverosh occupied the royal throne in the fortress Shushan in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all the officials and courtiers, the administration of Persia, Media, the nobles, and the governors of the provinces in his service. No fewer than 180 days he displayed the vast riches of his kingdom and the splendid glory of his majesty. At the end of this period, the king gave a banquet for 7 days in the court of the king's palace garden for all the people who lived in the fortress Shushan, high and low alike. All right, so we're given there's this big banquet, big party. And it describes all kinds of decorations that were there. There were a lot of drinking going on. And as verse 8, the rule for drinking was no restrictions. For the king had given orders to every palace steward to comply with each man's wishes. The Greek historians point out that the Persians were very heavy drinkers. They enjoyed drunken festivities. Also, what we know is that the men and women were not together for these things. The men would have their separate thing and the women would have theirs. And that's taken note of in a moment here, all right? In addition, Queen Vashti had a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Achashverosh. All right, so the men are one place, Vashti's in another. On the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, in other words, he was drunk, he ordered Mehuma, Bezata, Charbona, Bigata, Bakta, Zetar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs in attendance on King Achashverosh, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing a royal diadem to display her beauty to the peoples and the officials, for she was a beautiful woman. Now, the straightforward, simple reading of this is the way they've translated here. She was a beautiful woman. He wanted to show the world how beautiful his wife was. The rabbis, in their treatment of the story of Esther, try to make the bad characters as bad as possible, the good characters as good as possible, to defend what takes place as being righteous. And in order to do that, they take a lot of license in terms of midrashic treatment of the passage. Now, we're going to read in a minute that Queen Vashti was thrown out after this banquet. And that was necessary to make room for Esther to become the queen. Now, all of this, any historian worth their weight will tell you, all of this does not make any sense in the Persian Empire. The whole Megillat Esther cannot be defended as being literally true, as taking place exactly this way, because there's too many historical problems with it. Amongst them, first of all, we don't know, how do we identify Ahasuerus? Who is he in terms of the Persian kings of this era? We have knowledge of that era, knowledge of the kings, and we have problems with that. How could an Israelite, or even, well, in this case, we'll see in a minute, she's not even known to where she comes from, get to be queen of Persia? The queen had to come from certain royal families. But doesn't stop the rabbis from having creative license to play with the story. Now, since Vashti is going to be eliminated, we have to say she had to be a bad woman, because if she were a good woman, how could God just get her kicked out for no good reason? As we'll see in a moment. By the way, one of the important things to note as we go through Megillat Esther, God's name is never mentioned. We will not see one reference to God. We might have a hint that we'll come to. All right? So what do we do with Vashti? So Vashti, according to the rabbis, was a very wicked woman. She was cruel. She made all of her Israelite slaves, the women, serve her naked to humiliate them. And that's why when we read that the Megillat Esther says to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing a royal diadem, a royal crown. Literally to bring her in the royal crown. Doesn't say anything else about what she was wearing. So the rabbi said it means, since she was beautiful and Ahasuerus wanted to show her off, he wanted her to come naked, only wearing the crown. Now Vashti was not a nice lady, and she really would not have been bothered by having to show up naked. So miraculously, just before she gets the summons to come before King Ahasuerus and his hosts, she grows a tail. And because of that tail, she's embarrassed to come before Ahasuerus, and therefore she refuses to come. Okay. And so she refuses. The king gets very angry and says, what should we do with her? So a little bit later on, it says, the advisors, Queen Vashti has committed an offense not only against your majesty, but also against all the officials and all the peoples and all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will make all wives despise their husbands, as they reflect that King Ahasuerus himself ordered Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. All right, so, it's a very, the women are supposed to listen to their husbands. You hear that, ladies? You're supposed to do what your husband tells you to do. And now they're all worried. All the women in Persia are going to emulate Vashti. And when their husbands tell them what to do, they're going to say, get lost. So you have to, the very day the ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will cite it to all your majesty's officials, and there will be no end of scorn and provocation. If it please your majesty, let a royal edict be issued by you, and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be abrogated, that Vashti shall never enter the presence of King Ahasuerus. And you let your majesty bestow her royal state upon another who is more worthy than she. Then will the judgment executed by your majesty resound throughout your realm, vast though it is, and all wives will treat their husbands with respect, high and low alike. And then to make it even more ridiculous, after it says that it was approved by the king and dispatches, and now what does it say? dispatches were sent to all the provinces of the king, to every province in its own script, to every nation in its own language, that every man should wield authority in his home and speak the language of his own people. So if there was a mixed marriage between somebody who spoke Aramaic and somebody who spoke Persian, and the husband was Persian, you had to speak Persian at home. If the husband was Aramaic speaker, you had to speak Aramaic at home. None of this with the women pushing their husbands around. Okay. So it's clear from the opening chapter of Megillat Esther, if you really look at it with open eyes, that what we have here is a bit of a farce. And it's meant to be that way. It's not meant to be taken very, very seriously, I believe. All right. So now we have to have a queen now. Without a queen, can't be without a queen. So how do you choose a new queen? You don't put an ad in the newspaper. The king is looking for a queen. All those interested in applying send the post office box, whatever it is, in Shushan. So it says, sometime afterward, when the anger of King Achashverosh subsided, he thought of Vashti, what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty. Let your majesty appoint officers in every province of your realm to assemble all the beautiful young virgins in the fortress Shushan in the harem under the supervision of Haggai, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women. Let them be provided with their cosmetics, and let the maiden who pleases your majesty be queen instead of Vashti." The proposal pleased the king, and he acted upon it. So we're going to have a beauty contest. Throughout the realm, all the young virgins are to be rounded up, brought to Shushan, to the king's harem, and whoever pleased him, as we'll see in a minute how he decides who pleases him, gets to become queen instead of Vashti. Okay? So now we take a quick break in the normal reading of the Megillah, because we're going to introduce one of the heroes of the story, that hero being Mordechai. So it says, in the fortress Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Kish had, all right, so he's identified by his name and ancestry. He's Mordechai. His father was Yair. His grandfather was Shimi. And it would seem then his great-grandfather was Kish. And he happens to come from the tribe of Benjamin, even though he's called a Yehudi. At this time, after the destruction of the northern tribes, all that was left was Yehudah, and everybody, no matter what their tribe was, for the most part, become identified with Judah. But it's clear that they were aware of their ancestral background. And now, the translators in the JPS put in square brackets here, Kish had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried out into exile along with King Jechoniah of Yehudah, which had been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Now that Kish does not appear at that point in Megillat Esther. It is an editorial addition because it's not clear from the text who was exiled. And indeed, the rabbis of the Talmud assume it was Mordechai, which makes him a very, very old man at this point. Also, note his ancestry. We'll come back to Kish later on. Kish is a name that some of you may vaguely remember in the book of Samuel, but we will come back to that. Okay, so then he goes on to say, he was foster father to Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. For she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was shapely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordechai adopted her as his own daughter. Straightforward reading. He's got this niece whose name is in Hebrew Hadassah, but she's also known as Esther. Now, the names Mordechai and Esther are also in a certain sense problematic because Mordechai is probably a Hebraization of Marduk. Marduk was the chief of the Babylonian gods. And Esther was a Hebraization of Ishtar, a number one of the Babylonian gods. All right. The rabbis in the Talmud, in order to make the miracle, which is not spelled out exactly, more miraculous, say that actually she was not a beautiful woman. She had a bad complexion. But in any case, so we're introduced to Mordechai and Esther, who are going to be our hero and heroine of the story. When the king's order and edict was proclaimed, and when many girls were assembled in Fortress Shushan under the supervision of Haggai, Esther too was taken to the king's palace under the supervision of Haggai, the guardian of the women. The girl pleased him and won his favor, and he hastened to furnish her with her cosmetics and her rations, as well as the 7 maids who were her due from the king's palace. And he treated her and her maids with special kindness in the harem. Esther did not reveal her people or her kindred, for Mordechai told her not to reveal it. Okay, so we're given a little information here that's a little strange. Esther doesn't tell anybody that she comes from Judah, that she's a Jew. Mordechai told her to hide this information. Okay. Now, another interesting aspect of this. Now, the word Esther, which I said could be from the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, can also derive from Satar, Esther, to hide. God is Hester Panim, God's face is hidden at times in history. And the Megillat Esther is an example where God is not actively being present to act out in clear view to control events. It's a case where God acts in the background, hidden. And so, without necessarily knowing why, Mordechai, for some reason, told Esther not to reveal who she was, and that's going to be very important in the story of Mordechai and Esther. Okay. Every single day, Mordechai would walk about in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was faring and what was happening to her. This is a hint that Mordechai was somehow involved with the court, because he could walk around near the harem to see what was going on. So what was going on? When each girl's turn came to go to King Ahasuerus at the end of the 12 months treatment prescribed for women, for that was a period spent on beautifying them, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and women's cosmetics, and a whole year of the beauty spa. It was after that that the girl would go to the king. Whatever she asked for would be given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. She would go in the evening and leave in the morning for a second harem in charge of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, guardian of the concubines. She would not go again to the king unless the king wanted her, when she would be summoned by name. Okay, so King Ahasuerus would have the girl come to him at night. We're not told what takes place at night, but it's very clear what takes place at night. He has sexual relations with her. Since she's had sex with the king, she can't ever have sex with anybody else. And she won't ever have sex with the king again unless he summons her by name. Okay. So now it goes on to say, when the turn came for Esther, daughter of Avichai, the uncle Mordechai, who adopted her as his own daughter, to go to the king, she did not ask for anything but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women, advised. Yet Esther won the admiration of all who saw her. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won his grace and favor more than all the virgins. So he set a royal diadem on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. The king gave a great banquet for all his officials and courtiers, the banquet of Esther. He proclaimed the remission of taxes for the provinces and distributed gifts as benefits befits a king. Okay, so we should have a stop here for a moment But all of a sudden, what do we read? When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai sat in the palace gate. What do you mean a second time? The king's got a replacement for Esther, for Vashti. Well, clearly the king enjoyed his opportunities with the various virgins of Persia. So a simple reading is if he didn't give up on it, Esther would have to wait her turn when he would call her in. But the rabbis said he did this in order to make Esther jealous because she wouldn't tell him where she came from. So Mordecai was hanging around. He overhears two of King Ahasuerus's servants plotting against the king. He tells Esther, gets message to Esther. Esther reports it to the king in Mordecai's name. The two were executed. And then it's recorded in a book of annals at the instance of the king. A record was made, but end of story. Nothing about what happens for Mordecai's reward. Okay. Achar hadvarim ha'ela. Now we've gone to bring in the bad guy, the villain. Stage left, sometime afterward, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. He advanced him and seated him higher than any of his fellow officials. All the king's courtiers in the palace gate knelt and bowed low to Haman, for such was the king's order concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel or bow low. Then the king's courtiers who were in the palace gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's order?" When they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's resolve would prevail, for he had explained to them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel or bow down low to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews, Mordecai's people, throughout the kingdom of Ahasuerus. So Mordecai refuses to acknowledge Haman, to bow down to him. Now you'll hear people say, because Jews don't bow down to people. That's not true. If Jews didn't bow down to kings, there would be no Jews left in the world. Of course, they would bow down to kings. Some in telling the story, trying to understand it, says that Haman had some kind of statue or necklace that had a pagan god on it. And Mordecai would not bow down to that idol. I find that somewhat lacking. However, let's go back to the names. We're told that Haman was a son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. Agagite or Agagi in Hebrew, a descendant of Agag. Now you may remember I mentioned that Mordecai was a Benjaminite, descendant of Kish. Kish was the uncle of King Saul. Agag was the king of the Amalekites that Saul was supposed to kill after the battle. He doesn't, he lets him go, lets him live for a while. The prophet Samuel upbraids him for having done that. According to the Midrash, during the time that he was left alive before he was executed, he was able to get together with his wife, and therefore eventually Haman came into being. So Mordecai related to King Saul, Jews, and especially King Saul, who eventually loses his throne, his life and his throne because he didn't deal with Agag the way he should have, are ancestral enemies. Haman and Mordecai have a history that goes back in history. And that is the simplest understanding why Mordecai refused to bow down to him. The families and their family feuds. I just heard one of my former congregants, their family was on Family Feud this week. All right, anyway, okay. Now Haman, again, to add this kind of preposterous element to the whole story, decides he's not going to get rid of just Mordecai, but all of his people, all the Jews. Okay, so now we're told in the first month, the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, Pur, which means lot, Purim, Pur is the singular, Purim is the plural, lots, that's the name of the holiday, was cast before Haman concerning every day and every month until it fell in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. Haman then said to King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws, and it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. This is a aspersion cast on Jews throughout history, that Jews are distinct, different, they don't practice the way their neighbors do, they don't follow the laws of their neighbors, an ancient anti-Semitic slur. So he goes, says, please your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the stewards for deposit in the royal treasury. So Haman says, tell you what, these people are no good. You get rid of them, you're losing something. Okay, I'll give you money to make up for whatever loss you have. Now, there's a big debate in the Talmud and commentaries as what exactly, how do we regard King Ahasuerus? Is he a villain just like Haman? Is he more of a simpleton? Is he somebody easily misled? It's unclear. But what happens with this offer? Thereupon the king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite. See, they're going to keep repeating his ancestry. That's one of the reasons why I think it's so important that he is a descendant of Agag, that connection with the Agag of the time of King Saul. So the Agagite, the foe of the Jews. By the way, the word you hear here is ha-Yehudim. Yehudim could mean simply those who come from Judah, but of course that becomes a general name for Jews throughout the world history. All right. The king said, the money and the people are yours to do with as you see fit. Right? So it seems like he's refusing the money that Haman wants to give him, or it could be that he's telling Haman, you can take their money, the Jews' money, and do with as you see fit. Now replace your money you gave. Okay, so on the 13th day of the first month, the king's scribes were summoned and a decree was issued, as Haman directed, to the king's satraps, to the governors of every province. So they sent out these orders and issued in the name of King Ahasuerus, dispatched throughout his kingdom, that on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, that the Jews are to be slaughtered, men, women, and children, and their possessions plundered. All right? And the courtiers went out post haste on the royal mission. The decree was proclaimed in the fortress of Shushan. The king and Haman sat down to feast, but the city of Shushan was dumbfounded. So here now, after they make this decree, this annihilation of one of the peoples of the empire, Ahasuerus, Haman, have a nice meal. But everyone else, we're not talking about, it doesn't say the Jews, but everybody in Shushan, the officials of the kingdom, etc., they don't understand what's going on, why this is taking place. Okay. So Mordecai learns of this, and he tore his clothes and he put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went throughout the city crying out loudly and bitterly until he comes in front of the palace gate, because you couldn't enter the palace gate wearing sackcloth. And there's great mourning amongst Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing, everybody laying sackcloth and ashes. So when Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and informed her, the queen was greatly agitated. She sent clothing for Mordecai to wear so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he refused. Thereupon Esther summoned Hatach, one of the eunuchs whom the king had appointed to serve her, and sent him to Mordecai to learn the why and wherefore of it all. Hatach went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the palace gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and all about the money that Haman had offered to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him the written text of the law that had been claimed in Shushan for their destruction. Bade her tell Esther and inform her and charge her to go to the king and appeal to him and plead with him for a people. All right, so he says, Esther, you got to go to the king. So now, when he comes to Esther, Esther told Hathach to take back to Mordecai the following reply. All the king's courtiers and the people of the king's provinces know that if any person, man or woman, enters the king's presence in the inner court without having been summoned, there is but one law for him, that he be put to death. Only if the king extends the golden scepter to him may he live. Now, I have not been summoned to visit the king for the last 30 days. So Esther says, wait a minute. There's a law, and there was indeed such a rule. In order to protect the king from assassins, you had to be summoned to his throne room. And if you showed up without being summoned, you could be killed, unless the king had mercy on you. And Esther says, the king hasn't asked me around for the last month. So Esther's afraid. She's risking her life, and she thinks she might die as a result of that. All right? So when Mordecai was told what Esther had said, Mordecai had this message delivered to Esther. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. Now, in any other book of the Bible, we would probably expect to see something that God will step in. The Kadosh Baruch Hu, Elohim, Yevavke, he'll save us. And you, Esther, by not doing your part, you might die. But he doesn't say that. However, Mordechai says to her that from another place, another quarter. And the word makom, which means place or location, is understood by the rabbis as a reference to God. God is the place of the world is not the place of God. So first, Mordechai says, if you fail to do this, I'm sure God will save us. Furthermore, maybe that's the very reason you got to be queen. So you would be there when it was necessary. So Esther sent back this answer to Mordecai, go assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan and fast in my behalf or on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will observe the same fast. Then I shall go to the king, though it is contrary to the law, and if I am to perish, I shall perish. So Mordecai went about the city and did just as Esther had commanded him. Once again, when Esther says fast, why not say pray? Beseech God. Any other book would have done that. Clearly, the effort is made not to mention God directly in Megillat Esther. There are various theories why that's the case. My favorite is basically because the nature of the book of Esther is not to be taken too seriously. It's more on the farce level. And that's why others say is because the nature of the story in the book, Jews were afraid if God's name was in it, it might be desecrated, and so they didn't put his name in it. Okay, so we're ready for Esther to go see the king. So the third day, Esther put on royal apparel, stood in the inner court of the king's palace, facing the king's palace, while the king was sitting in his royal throne in the throne room facing the entrance of the palace. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor. Thank God. The king extended Esther the golden scepter, which he had in his hand, and Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. What troubles you, Queen Esther? The king asked her. And what is your request? Even to have the kingdom, it should be granted you. He says, I'll even give you half my kingdom if that's what you want. I'm just not serious, I would hope. If you please, your majesty, Esther replied, let your majesty and Haman come today to the feast that I've prepared for him. The king commanded, tell Haman to hurry and do Esther's bidding. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther prepared. Esther can't confront Haman directly. The ancient courts. Yeah. Somebody say something?
Where's Reuben? No, I thought you said 5 minutes and you.
Okay. Somebody's needs to mute their microphone.
To go to bed. It's 9 o'clock.
Ruin. All right. So,
Sorry?
the idea that you can't just confront a Haman. He's too powerful. He's got friends at court. Esther couldn't be sure who would support her or not. So she has to find a way around. So she begins by planting a seed in Ahasuerus's mind. She says, she doesn't just invite the king to come to a meal, but she invites the king and Haman. And when the king asks what is it she really wants, she says, I want both of you back here tomorrow. Again, strange kind of thing. That's obviously he's got to get the king a little upset. Now it goes on to say that day Haman went out happy and lighthearted. And, after all, he had a private dinner with the king and the queen. Why wouldn't he be happy? It's like you were invited to Queen Elizabeth's for a private dinner with nice kosher meals for you. All right. You'd be kind of happy, even it was Prime Minister, what's his name? Trudeau. All right. So he's happy. But what happens? He sees Mordecai and he gets all upset. He gets filled with rage. So he goes home, calls his friends, and everybody tells him what happened and how he's got all these wonderful things, and yet it makes him miserable. So his wife Zeresh and his friend said to him, so let a stake be put up 50 cubits high, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then you can go gaily to the king to the feast. The proposal pleased Haman, and he had the stake put up. And so great idea. We're going to kill Mordecai tomorrow. We'll put a stake, because I said they execute people and then they impale them on a stake. So everybody see it. So it ends with Haman being very happy. And this is carefully crafted. The book of Esther is carefully crafted because of what happens next. That night, sleep deserted the king. And he ordered the book of records, the annals, to be brought and was read to the king. And remember, back when Mordecai saved the king's life, it was put in it was recorded, but nothing happened. So there was found in the books that written that Mordecai denounced Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold. So he said, what honor or advancement had been conferred on Mordecai for this? So they tell him nothing. Right? He says, nothing's been done to reward Mordecai. So the king says, who's out in the court? Who's around? As it says, for Haman had just entered the outer court of the royal palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai impaled on the stake he had prepared for him. Okay, king was just told that Mordecai saved his life. Haman comes in to see the king, and he wants to ask the king to kill the guy who the king just learned or was reminded had saved his life. Okay. So the king has Haman brought in. The king says, what should be done for a man whom the king desires to honor? So Haman said to the king, well, first of all, he says, Haman said to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? He's, real stuck up. He said, after all, who would, the king's asking me about honoring somebody. Who else would he want to honor but me? So what would I want? What would be pleasing to me? So he says, what should be done for a man? So Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king desires to honor, let royal garb, which the king has worn, be brought, and a horse on which the king is ridden, on whose head a royal diadem has been set. And let the attire and the horse be put in the charge of one of the king's noble courtiers. And let the man whom the king desires to honor be attired and paraded on the horse through the city square, while they proclaim before him, this is what is done for the man whom the king desires to honor. So Haman's saying, oh boy, look, I'm going to have a great parade. I'm going to be all. Quick then, said the king to Haman, get the garb and the horse you have said, and do this to Mordecai the Jew, who sits in the king's gate. All right? Rub it in, not just Mordecai, but Mordecai the Jew. And you're going to be the one parading him. Omit nothing that you propose. So Haman took the garb and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and paraded him through the city square and proclaimed before him, this is what is done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate while Haman hurried home, his head covered in mourning. Okay, so Haman has now been, he was up here in cloud 9, and he's down at the bottom. There's a great midrash, the rabbis say, because it says here in mourning. Now the word mourning clearly here just means just upset. All right. But avelut, mourning is also the word used when somebody dies. So according to the midrash, one of Haman's daughters had climbed up on the roof of their house, and she had a chamber pot with her. And when she heard what was going on, she assumed that Mordecai was leading the horse and her father Haman was on the horse. And so when the parade comes by the house, she dumps the chamber pot on the head of Mordecai. But lo and behold, it's not Mordecai, it's her father Haman. Mortified, she throws herself off the roof of the house and dies. And so Haman is in mourning. Okay, so there Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had befallen him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, what would you say? He said, keep it up. Don't worry. You'll get over this. You'll survive. Things will go well. Don't give up hope. What do they say though? If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish stock, you will not overcome him. You will fall before him to your ruin. Too bad for you. You're out of luck. You're gonna get it. And while they were still speaking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurriedly brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So again, they go to the banquet. So the king says to Esther, what did you want? Queen Esther replied, if your majesty will do me the favor, and if it pleases your majesty, let my life be granted me as my wish, and my people as my request. Save my life, save my people's lives. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, massacred, and exterminated. Had we only been sold as bondmen and bondwomen, I would have kept silent, for the adversary is not worthy of the king's trouble. So if only been sold as a slave, okay, I wouldn't bother you with this. But we're going to die. Thereupon King Ahasuerus demanded of Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who dared to do this? And now, how does Esther respond? The adversary and enemy replied, Esther, is this evil Haman? And Haman cringed in terror before the king and the queen. Right? The king now, brought a second meal, now told that somebody's trying to kill her. The king is so upset. And when he says, who is it? She says, Haman. He's so angry, he has to walk out of the room. And what happens? The king in his fury left the wine feast for the palace garden, while Haman remained to plead with Queen Esther for his life. For he saw the king had resolved to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet room, Haman was lying prostrate on the couch in which Esther reclined. He's begging Esther, save me. So they reclined on the couches when they ate. So he's on the couch with Queen Esther, begging. And whether it's a mistake on the king's part or it's intentional on his king's part, what does he say? Does he mean, cried the king, to ravish the queen in my own palace? You're attacking my wife? Gonna rape her in my palace? No sooner did these words leave the king's lips than Haman's face was covered. The Harbonah, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, what is more, a stake is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, the man whose word saved the king. Impale him on it, the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the stake which he put up for Mordecai, and the king's fury abated. Okay, so Haman's eliminated. He's hung by his own petard, as they say. End of story. Well, no, not yet. So Ahasuerus gives the property of Haman to Queen Esther, and Mordecai comes to the king, and Esther reveals the relationship, and he puts Mordecai in place of Haman, and gives him his property. And so again, now Esther goes to see the king without being summoned. The king lets her in and says, what can I do now? So, well, you got this decree that went out to kill us. You got to countermand the decree. So the king says, I can't, there's nothing I can do. Once a decree has been made, it cannot be canceled. So they summon them and they have a new letter goes out that the Jews are allowed to defend themselves. They can protect their lives on the 13th of the 12th month, the month of Adar. And so obviously they are able to save themselves. Everybody's happy. In chapter 9, on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, the day before Purim, when the king's command and decree were to be executed, the very day in which the enemies of the Jews had expected to get them in their power, the opposite happened. And the Jews got their enemies in their power. Throughout the province of King Ahasuerus, the Jews mustered in their cities to attack those who sought their hurt. And no one could withstand them, for the fear of them had fallen upon all the peoples. Indeed, all the officials in the provinces, the satraps, the governors, the king's stewards, showed deference to the Jews because the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. So the Jews struck at their enemies, destroying them and killing them. And so it says then, in the fortress of Shushan, the Jews killed a total of 500 men. They also killed the son of Haman, son of Mendatha, for the Jews. I'm supposed to read that in one breath. I used to read that in my synagogue. Okay. The 10 sons of Haman, and they have, so Esther goes to see the king. Okay, what's now? And you having to die now? She says, well, we got to protect ourselves yet in Shushan. We still have more fighting. So the Jews in Shushan fought another day. So those out in the provinces feasted on the 14th because they were through fighting. Those in Shushan had to wait until the 15th. That's why we have the two different dates to feast. In fact, all right. And then we're told towards the end, when Queen Esther's son of Abihail wrote a second letter for Purim for the purpose of confirming in full authority the aforementioned one of Mordecai the Jew. Mordecai recorded these events a little earlier, and he sent dispatches to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, near and far, charging them to observe the 14th and 15th days of Adar every year, the same days in which the Jews enjoyed relief from their foes, and the same month which had been transferred for them from one of grief and mourning to one of festive joy. They were to observe them as days of feasting and merrymaking, an occasion for sending gifts to one another and presents to the poor. Okay. And they're also supposed to remember this, to observe them. And so there's to recount what took place. Those are the 4 mitzvot of Purim. And then it ends, Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the mainland and the islands, all his might, etc., etc. For Mordecai the Jew ranked next to King Ahasuerus and was highly regarded by the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brethren. He sought the good for his people and interceded for the welfare of his kindred. All right, so that's one of my favorite books in the Bible to go over. I always love it. Okay, so certainly you will find some who take the book of Esther straightforward. I think it's literally true. I can't. There are too many historical issues involved with it. Certainly, the background is the Persian Empire. There are a lot of Persian loan words that appear in this, a number of Persian customs that were clearly identifiable in the book of Esther. It also, though, follows certain patterns of literature of that era, of intrigue between different elements in the Persian Empire, the court of the Persian emperor. The vizier or headman and another, or one of the wives, and the fights in the harem, what have you, all these kinds of things serve as a background for it. But it has become, it is one of the biblical books. It is one of the holidays that we have an opportunity to really just have fun with. Rejoicing, feasting, reading and making noises. It's one of the few times in the synagogue that you're allowed to make noise. Not that stops people sometimes otherwise. But every time Haman is mentioned, we use groggers, the noisemakers, or ring bells, all kinds of things that are done in order to blot out the name of Haman, to salute Mordecai and Esther. And also, though, it has in it a message that we don't always know where the hand of God is. Things happen. Sometimes God is visible in history. Sometimes God seems to be missing in history. Sometimes God's hand in history is or are people. Esther was there at the right time. Esther was able to defeat the plot of Haman. Now, she's very clearly a human being, but nonetheless, she saves Israel. And is that God not working through Israel? God working through Esther. Whenever we're confronted with evil, we're confronted with things in the world, you don't say, wait for God to do something, we do something. And thus we can become the instrument of God in the world. Okay? Do we have any questions? All right, next week, I hope you have a good time with Purim. And in 2 weeks, I hope you have a good time with the test. I will again send it to you in advance. You will take it and then we'll go over it together on that Wednesday night. Okay? All right, have a freilichen Purim, as they say. Have a good, happy Purim. Good night.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.